So you have some notes that we're going to do to review the types of sentences before we get back into doing our mastery grid. I want to do a little review of this. It's been a little while. So you're going to take some notes, and then after taking notes, you're going to do a little exit pass. So we're going to review types of sentences. We spent a lot of time at the beginning of the year talking about simple sentences as we talked about phrases. A simple sentence has one independent clause. That means it has one subject and verb grouping. So it could have one subject, one verb. Mrs. Culleton ran. It could have two subjects and one verb, like Mrs. Culleton and Mrs. Dean ran. It could have one subject doing two actions. Mrs. Culleton ate and ran. Or it could have two subjects doing those same two verbs. Mrs. Culleton and Mrs. Dean ate and ran. But they all present one main idea, and so that's one independent clause. A compound sentence has two independent clauses. Think of a compound word. And it could be independent clauses separated with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or a semicolon could take the place of both that comma and conjunction. And then the new thing we started talking about in December were complex sentences. And complex sentences also have an independent clause, but then we introduced this new idea of the dependent clause. And I want you to think about you being a dependent person on your parents. You need them to survive, to get through life. A dependent clause needs an independent clause. You'll never see a dependent clause all by itself. And sometimes the dependent clause can come at the end, and sometimes it can come at the beginning. And if it's at the beginning, you need a comma. And we've also talked about times where it might be in the middle, but we're going to make sure we understand this before we tackle that. So we've got to make sure that we understand what a dependent clause is. It starts with one of these words called a subordinating conjunction. The fanboys are our coordinating conjunctions, and those are a little easier because there are only 7 of them. But with subordinating conjunctions, we have so many. Hopefully, as you start recognizing how sentences work together, you'll start recognizing these words and you don't need to have them memorized. So a subordinating conjunction, its job is to start a dependent clause. It's going to be the very first word. And in order to be a subordinating conjunction, it's going to have a subject and a verb after it. And so this is a common list of our subordinating conjunctions. Just like fanboys have a mnemonic to help us remember them, subordinating conjunctions have this one to help us remember them. AWUBIS. A lot of them begin with an A, W, U, B, I, and S. So these 5 are highlighted after, as, until, before, and since, because they can also be prepositions. And that's why this formula is really important. If it's got a subject and a verb after it, it's a subordinating conjunction. But if it has just a noun after it, you're going to notice it's not a subordinating conjunction anymore. It's a preposition. I could just say after school. And after school is a prepositional phrase. If I said after school ended, now I put a verb with it. Now it's a subordinating conjunction. And then I also have because here highlighted because we have to watch out for that one. When it's with of immediately following it, it's a preposition. Because of the snowstorm, that's a preposition. But when it's because by itself, it's a subordinating conjunction. Because it snowed, you've got a subject and a verb, it's a subordinating conjunction. So these are 6 that we just really need to kind of keep an eye on. So when we talk about the dependent clause, again, a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction, has a subject and a verb after it. Because I studied. When the boy fell. Subject and a verb. After the football game ended. Now, if I didn't have this verb here, and this grouping of words just ended like this, after the football game, that is a prepositional phrase. There's no verb. When you put the verb with it, it becomes a dependent clause. Now, we could have our independent clause at the beginning and the dependent clause at the end. An independent clause is a complete sentence. I got an A on the test. If I want to expand on that idea, make that sentence a little more descriptive, I got an A on the test because I studied. I could add a dependent clause. By itself, because I studied, is not a complete thought. It's a dependent clause. It needs to be attached to the independent clause. Notice when the dependent clause is at the end, there's no punctuation in between them. An old woman cried. That's a complete thought. But there's missing information here. I could add to that. Why did she cry? An old woman cried when the boy fell. We went for pizza after the football game ended. So when we put an independent clause with a dependent clause, we end up with these complex sentences. Now, I could switch this around and put the dependent clause at the beginning, but notice that you've got to have a comma. So I'm going to take those same 3 sentences and switch them around. Because I studied, I got an A on the test. Same meaning. It's author's or writer's choice whether or not you wanted to put it at the beginning or the end. But if you notice that you had a lot of sentences that were starting with I, this is an easy way to switch up your sentence structure and change your fluency. When the boy fell, an old woman cried. After the football game ended, we went for pizza. So when the dependent clause is at the beginning, you hear that natural pause when you read it. You need a comma. So what you're going to do here is label the sentences, and I want you to give me a formula. If the independent clause comes at the beginning, you're going to put ID for independent, then dependent. If the dependent clause is at the beginning, you're going to put D, comma I, because you would need that comma there. The dependent clause is at the beginning. It's being used as a transition. So I'm going to do the first one with you. If I get an A, my mom will give me $50. Now, the clue here might be that there's a comma. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but sometimes when you see a comma, that could indicate that you have a clause or a phrase at the beginning. So I'm going to look at my list and see, do I see a subordinating conjunction in here anywhere? And I do, if. So I'm going to put a box around it, and then I'm going to figure out where that clause ends. If what? If I get an A. So you're going to box if and underline if I get an A. That is a dependent clause. So you're going to put D, comma, I. And you're going to go through and do these other 4 sentences the same way. Look for the subordinating conjunction, put a box around it, underline the dependent clause, and then write the formula. When you're done, you turn this in as your exit ticket.